The desert had a way of pretending to sleep, stretching itself across the horizon in long, exhausted breaths while quietly watching every creature that dared to cross it. By late afternoon, its silence deepened into something close to warning. Near a ragged outcrop of wind-carved stone lay the young Apache woman, half buried in dust and failing light. Her body was curled inward, as if trying to hide the last warmth still trapped beneath her ribs. The wind, shifting in thin sighs, lifted strands of her hair and set them drifting across her face like brittle threads of night. Her breaths came shallow, scattered, as though the desert itself was stealing them one by one. There were days when she had moved with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged to these lands. But now her steps had been spent, burned away under the furnace of the sun, leaving nothing but the trembling shell of survival. A pair of scavenger birds circled overhead, small shadows gliding in lazy spirals, patient, unhurried. They knew the desert's ledger better than any man. They knew when a life tipped toward the edge. The woman tried to raise her head once, a slow, tortured motion. Her vision split the world into shards of color, the rust-red earth, the pale bones of dead yucca, the fading gold of the sky. Each hue flickered, then dimmed, as though sinking beneath water. She whispered something, not a word so much as the memory of one. A name, perhaps. Or a prayer. The wind stole it before it could form fully. The last of her strength broke. Her body sagged into the ground, surrendering to the sinking weight of dusk. And as the sun slipped behind the far mesas, the desert grew quiet, as if waiting to see whether she would return to it, or be claimed by it for good. The rancher, Elias Crow, had been riding fence line when he first saw the shape on the ground, nothing more than a dark fold in the dust, almost mistaken for a fallen deer or a discarded tarp beaten flat by wind. But something made him rein in his horse. A feeling. A narrowing in his chest he had learned never to ignore. He watched the distant form for a long moment, his eyes tracing the stillness around it. The desert was too quiet there, as if it were holding breath. Elias had seen enough bodies to know the difference between death and the waiting edge of it. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his beard. "Damn it," he muttered, though there was no one to hear. Old instincts, some inherited, some born from years of conflict, told him to turn away. Trouble didn't just follow the Apache, it grew around them like storm clouds building over dry plains. He knew what people said. He knew what violence could rise when cultures clashed on soil that refused to forget past blood. But still he sat there, horse shifting beneath him, staring at the unmoving body. A memory stirred, something quieter, far older than the wars of men. His late wife's voice came back to him, carried on the dust, "Elias, you don't leave a soul to die alone. Not out here." He swallowed. The desert stretched endlessly around him, the sun bleeding slow red braids into the sky. His choice echoed into that space, louder than any gunshot. He nudged his horse forward. As he approached, he saw the frailty in the woman's frame, the cracked skin at her temples, the rise and fall of her chest, so faint as to be almost imaginary. For a moment, Elias felt something shift inside him, a near-forgotten ache. He knelt beside her, the leather of his coat creaking as he slid an arm beneath her shoulders. "You're not dyin' out here," he said softly, the words more vow than statement. It was the kind of vow that changed the shape of a man's life. He lifted her carefully, her body weightless with exhaustion, her breath brushing the fabric of his shirt like the delicate, uncertain flutter of a moth's wing. And with that single choice, the lines of his world, already drawn by drought, work, and grief, shifted in ways he could not yet see. Elias crossed the final stretch toward his homestead at a careful pace, the Apache woman held against him like something made of smoke and bone. The sky had cooled to a pale lavender, the last streaks of daylight thinning across the plains. In the quiet, the soft creak of saddle leather and the muted thud of hooves felt louder than they should have, like intruders in a place meant only for whispers. His ranch sat humble against the broad face of the land, a long porch of weather-worn planks, a few corrals, and the low adobe quarters where the 4 Apache maids stayed. Their silhouettes lingered near the cookhouse, their movements deliberate, their presence steady as dusk. As Elias rode in, their conversation stilled. The women turned, their eyes narrowing with a sharp, instinctive alertness born not of fear but of recognition. They knew the sight of one of their own half broken by the desert. They knew what the land did to those left too long beneath its indifferent sky. Elias felt the tension settle like a fine dust across the yard. He dismounted carefully, cradling the woman as though she might crumble with any sudden motion. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the eldest of the maids, Nature, stepped forward. She did not speak. She simply looked at the woman's face, studying the bruised lips, the faint tremor of breath. Her gaze flicked to Elias, assessing him, weighing him, measuring the choice he had already made. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how heavy his actions felt. She was out there alone, he said quietly. Would not have lasted another hour. No accusation came from them. No approval either. Only silence, deep, ancient, and unreadable. Nature gestured toward the main house.
Elias nodded, pushing open the door with his shoulder and stepping into the dim interior where lamplight waited, soft and fragile, like a sanctuary not yet certain of its purpose. He laid the woman on the spare bed, the shadows of the room folding gently around her. For the first time, their breaths mingled in the same air, 2 strangers bound by a choice the desert had witnessed in silence.
The room held a stillness that felt almost brittle, thin air, lamplight trembling softly against the walls, and the faint rustle of canvas curtains settling as night pressed in. Elias stood at the threshold for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust. The woman lay motionless on the narrow bed, though a subtle tightening at her jaw suggested she was not as unconscious as she appeared. B-roll, warm lamplight over a sparsely furnished frontier bedroom. He moved slowly, mindful of every sound his boots made. The maids gathered at the doorway behind him, their presence quiet but sharp-edged, their eyes following the small gestures of his hands. They did not fully trust him with one of their own. But they did not stop him either. Elias set a tin cup of water on the table, the surface trembling with the faint vibration of his uncertainty. He placed a folded blanket beside her, thick and still warm from the hearth. Her eyelids flickered. He paused, meeting that brief sliver of awareness. Her gaze was clouded, but beneath the exhaustion he felt something like calculation, measuring him, questioning him, bracing for some cruelty the world had taught her to expect. "It's just water," Elias said quietly, his voice low enough to respect the space between them. "Cold as the well would give." He lifted the cup and eased it toward her lips. She recoiled, weakly, instinctively, her breath catching as her fingers twitched toward the empty space where a weapon should have been. The movement was small, but the fear behind it was vast. Elias stilled. "No harm meant," he murmured, more to the room than to her. Nature stepped forward silently and touched the woman's wrist, grounding her. Their eyes met, an exchange heavy with shared history, kinship, and something unspoken that Elias could not name. Slowly, the woman relented, allowing the cup to tilt. The water touched her lips, and her body shuddered at the shock of it. Elias looked away, granting her dignity in that vulnerable moment. He set a small plate of bread on the bedside table, though he knew she likely wouldn't touch it for hours. Trust was a slow thing. Hard-earned. Easily damaged. As he stepped back from the bed, the woman's gaze followed him, not warm, not grateful, but no longer entirely guarded. A flicker of acknowledgement. A sliver of permission for him to remain. And in that dim-lit room, with shadows stretching long across the floorboards, the first fragile threads of healing began to weave themselves between strangers. Night deepened around the ranch house, settling like a heavy wool blanket over the land. The desert's earlier heat had slipped away, leaving behind a cool hush that carried the distant cry of a nightbird and the soft tremor of wind grazing against the adobe walls. Inside, the woman slept fitfully, her breaths shallow, her fingers curling around the blanket as though holding on to some truth only the dark could understand. Elias sat on a stool by the door, head bowed, elbows resting on his knees. He kept his distance, giving her the quiet that suffering often demanded. Nature returned after a time, carrying a small object wrapped in doeskin. She said nothing as she approached the bed, though her footsteps made no more sound than dust drifting across stone. Carefully, she placed the bundle near the woman's hand. A faint stir ran through the patient's body. Her eyes opened, just barely, and for the first time, true recognition glinted there. Her fingers brushed the doeskin bundle. Inside lay a tiny charm, a circle of woven horsehair threaded with 2 beads of red stone. A protective token, simple but ancient in meaning. A sound escaped her, soft, fragile, more breath than voice. She began to hum, the melody thin as smoke rising from a dying fire. It was an old tribal lullaby, its notes shaped by memory rather than strength. The song drifted through the room, carrying with it the echo of campfires long extinguished and a lineage rooted deep in the land. Elias listened, struck by the way grief and endurance intertwined in each wavering note. When the song faded, she let the charm rest against her chest, her gaze lifting to him for a single moment. Not trust, something quieter. A recognition that he had not taken the charm away. In that simple exchange, a bridge formed, fragile, unspoken, but real. Morning arrived slowly, as though unsure it wished to cross the threshold of the night before it. Pale sunlight seeped across the horizon, touching the ranch yard with a thin wash of gold. Elias stepped outside, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes. The air was cool, its quiet broken only by the distant rumble of cattle shifting in their pens. He moved with purpose, though unease tracked him like a long shadow. Something in the wind felt changed. Thinner. Watchful. Near the water trough, nature waited. She did not call out to him, she simply pointed to the ground. Elias crouched beside her, letting his eyes follow the gesture. At first glance, he saw nothing unusual, just dust, scattered prints of boots and hooves from the day before. But then he noticed them. Bare feet, 4 distinct sets, pressed lightly into the earth where the maids often walked. But beside them, cutting deeper into the soil, were heavy prints belonging to a man who had not slept under Elias Crow's roof. The mark was fresh. Too fresh. Elias felt his jaw tighten. How long? He asked. Nature raised 2 fingers. 2 hours, perhaps less. He stood slowly, the morning light sharpening across his face, revealing the line of tension carved along his brow. He scanned the distant ridges, where the desert rose in quiet folds toward the pale sky. For a moment, the land appeared still. Then, far off, something shifted. A faint smudge. Dust rising where no cattle grazed, no riders belonged. Someone was watching, Elias murmured. Nature nodded once. The others had sensed it too. He exhaled, long and measured, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper against his ribs. He thought of the woman sleeping inside, of the charm she held, the bruise at her Trouble was coming. Not in bluster or thunder, but in the quiet, certain way danger crept across open land, unseen until it was too late. Elias turned back toward the house, boots grinding softly against the earth. Whatever hunted her, had now found his home. The afternoon passed with a strange heaviness, as though the air itself was listening. Inside the quiet of the small bedroom, the Apache woman stirred again. Elias entered softly, a basin of warm water in hand, the doorway framing him like a hesitant question. She was awake this time, fully, though weakened. Her gaze tracked him with a wary, flinching alertness. She held the charm against her chest like a tether to something she refused to let the world take. Elias set the basin down and kneeled beside the bed, rolling up his sleeves. "You're hurt," he said, not as an accusation but as a simple truth. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Instead, her eyes drifted away, toward the wall, toward some memory still too sharp to name. He dipped a cloth into the water, wrung it out carefully, and offered it to her. For a long moment she did not move. Then, with effort, she accepted it, letting it rest between her fingers. Silence lingered. Heavy. Expectant. Elias sat back on his heels, letting the quiet lead. "You're safe here," he said finally. "Far as I can make it so." Her breath trembled, barely perceptible, but enough to betray the fracture beneath her composure. "My family," she whispered, voice thin as wind slipping through canyon stone. He looked up, meeting her eyes. She seemed smaller suddenly, swallowed by recollection. He nodded, encouraging her gently. "They were taken," she said, the words torn from places still bleeding. "At dawn. Men with rifles. They burned one of our lodges. The smoke woke me." She swallowed. "I ran. I heard them behind me. I did not stop." Elias felt a familiar cold settle into his bones. "Raiders," he murmured. "Or worse." She closed her eyes, tears gathering at the corners, though none fell. "Strength, even in grief. I tried to reach them," she said. "My father, my brothers. But there were too many. And the fire was," she paused, voice catching on the memory. Elias bowed his head. The pain in her voice struck something raw within him. His hand tightened involuntarily at his knee. "You're not the only one," he said quietly, surprising himself with the confession. "I lost my wife, 5 winters back. A fever took her. Took everything I'd built this place for." The woman opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a depth that startled them both. She sang, Elias continued. "Even at the end. Said songs were the last thing the world could take." A flicker passed across the woman's face, recognition, kinship, or perhaps the simple truth that grief understood grief with no need for explanation. "I sang too," she whispered. Their voices softened into the stillness, 2 broken histories laid bare in a room too small to contain the weight of them. For the first time, neither looked away. In that fragile moment, their wounds touched, not to deepen, but to recognize each other. And from that recognition, the first true bond was forged, quiet, deep, and irrevocably human. The sun hung lower by late afternoon, casting long, amber bars of light across the room where she rested. The earlier storm of confession had softened something between them, an unseen thread now stretched from her quiet suffering to his long-held grief. Elias felt it each time he stepped through the doorway, the air no longer resisted him. It simply waited. She pushed herself upright with effort, refusing the frailty that still clung to her limbs. Elias moved quickly, steadying her without touching her directly, his hands hovering, offering support without assuming the right to give it. "You don't have to sit up yet," he said gently. "I must." Her voice was fragile still, but with a new edge beneath it, something shaped by resolve rather than fear. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, inhaling deeply. "I cannot lie here while you risk for me." He blinked, startled by the clarity of her words. "You're not a burden," he replied. A faint smile touched her lips, not joy, but acknowledgement. A small flame catching. "In my people," she said slowly, "one who takes refuge must give back. Even a child offers something. A story, a song, labor of the hands." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the land stretched in unforgiving beauty. "If I stay, I must earn this place." Elias shook his head. "You need rest more than work." She reached to the small table beside her and picked up the horsehair charm, her fingers steadying around the woven circle. "I know herbs," she said. "I can mend wounds. Keep sickness from the cattle. I know how to read storms before they come. And I have eyes for danger that your men do not." The truth of it settled heavily in the room. Elias exhaled, not resisting her offer this time. "You're still hurt," he said. "But when you're strong enough, we'll find something fitting." She nodded once, the gesture formal, almost ceremonial. "And my name," she added quietly, "is Tessa." Elias gave a slow nod in return, respectful, waited. "Tessa," he repeated, letting the name settle like a stone placed with intention upon sacred ground. "Then you're welcome here, as long as you choose to be." Her eyes held his, unwavering now. "I choose," she whispered. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. She was no longer a wounded stranger sheltered in his home. She had become a presence, intentional, aware, and undeniably part of the land beneath them. Tessa woke before dawn. The world outside was still blue with night's last breath, the air holding that thin, trembling quiet that only exists just before morning breaks. Her body still ached, but the sharp edges of pain had dulled to something manageable, something she had long ago learned to live beside, not under. She wrapped Elias's spare coat around her shoulders and stepped quietly toward the doorway. She wanted to see the land again. Wanted to know where she stood. The porch boards creaked under her feet as she stepped out into the cold. The ranch stretched before her, still asleep, the fences like dark lines drawn onto the earth, the cattle barely shifting in the distance, the smell of wood smoke lingering from last night's fire. But her eyes instinctively went further. Up the ridge. Her breath caught. There, almost invisible in the dim light, sat a sliver of movement. A shape too still, too deliberate to be wildlife. Someone on horseback, watching the valley below. Watching the ranch. She froze, her pulse quickening. A memory flashed through her, the ambush, the men who hunted her, the rough voices snarling in the dark. Her hand tightened around the railing. "Tessa." Elias's voice came softly from behind her. She didn't turn. "Someone is up on the ridge." He stepped out beside her, still buttoning his shirt, his eyes narrowing as he followed her gaze. He squinted, adjusting to the low light, but the shape was already melting back into the rocky edge, swallowed by shadows. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. They were watching. Elias's jaw tensed. He didn't doubt her, that much was clear. "I'll take a rifle and check the perimeter," he said. "No," her voice cut through the cold air, sharp and sure. "If they saw you ride up after them, you'd never return." He stared at her, surprised by the certainty in her tone. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked. Tessa turned toward him, her face pale in the early light, but her eyes steady, calculating. "They're testing you," she said. "Seeing if you're alone. Seeing if you can protect what's yours." Elias swallowed, unease flickering across his features. "And you?" he asked quietly. "Are they looking for you?" She held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "I don't know," she said. "But danger has found this place now, whether by accident or by the trail I left behind." The wind stirred between them, carrying the first traces of sunrise. Tessa looked back at the ridge, her expression sharpening into something no longer fueled by fear, but readiness. "This land is no longer quiet," she murmured. "And neither can we be." Elias didn't saddle a horse. Didn't grab a rifle. Didn't storm up the ridge to chase ghosts that already knew the land better than he did. Instead, he stood in the center of his yard with his boots planted firmly in the dust, shoulders squared, breath visible in the cold morning air. He watched the horizon as the sun finally broke over it, quiet, steady, relentless. A new day. And with it, the truth he could no longer walk around. Tessa stepped down from the porch, moving carefully, still weakened but no longer fragile. The coat he'd given her hung loose around her frame, but her posture carried its own strength, like a bowed tree that had survived too many storms to be easily uprooted again. "You don't look surprised," she said softly. Elias didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the ridge until he felt her come to stand at his side. "I'm not," he finally said. "Out here, trouble is like weather. It don't care if you're ready for it." She studied him, the way he didn't fidget or pace, the way he seemed to grow stiller the more danger pressed in. "You're calm," she said. "Too calm." He huffed a small laugh. "I learned a long time ago, panic don't fix a thing." The wind swept between them, carrying dust and the faint smell of pine from the hills. "Tell me what you saw," he said. So she did. She described the silhouette, the posture of the rider, the unmoving patience, the way the horse didn't shift or graze, as if trained to silence. She described the way the figure had retreated, not startled, not hurried, not clumsy, but deliberate. "Bounty man?" Elias asked. "Could be," she murmured. "Could also be the ones who took my family. They scattered after that night, but men like that don't forget loose ends." A muscle tightened in Elias's jaw. "Tessa, you don't owe me your past. But I need to know what kind of fire is headed my way." For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes drifted toward the ridge, toward the places where memory and danger blurred. "They weren't after my family," she said finally. "They were after land. And anyone who stood in their way." Elias's brow furrowed. "Land?" She nodded. "Land with water. Land with minerals. Land that men with soft hands and hungry pockets wanted." He stared at her, a quiet dread forming. "And you think they followed you?" "I think they might be checking," she replied. "Seeing if I'm alone, or if I've found shelter." Elias looked back toward the ridge, then toward his house, his life he'd built from years of blistered palms and sweat and stubbornness. "You didn't bring this on me," he said quietly. "The world did. The kind that wants to take more than it ever needs." She looked at him sharply. "Elias, you don't understand. These men, they don't negotiate. They don't warn. They erase." He met her gaze, firm as bedrock. "I've been erased before," he said. "Didn't stay that way." She opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to hold something steady between them. I'm drawing a line, he said, looking out across the yard. Right here. On this dirt. Between what's mine to protect, and what I'll never run from again. Tessa stared at him, her throat tightening. You're willing to die for that line? Elias shook his head. No. But I'm willing to live for it. The words hung between them, simple, weather-worn, but true. A moment later, the cattle in the far pasture stirred as if sensing something uneasy in the air. A pair of crows lifted off the fence, wings cutting sharp arcs against the brightening sky. Tessa felt the shift too. A coming. The day had hardened into heat by mid-morning, yet the chill of expectation lingered over the ranch like a second shadow. Elias moved quietly across the yard, rifle in hand, his eyes sweeping the horizon in small, precise arcs. Each fence post, each rock, each curling wisp of dust was a marker now, a signal of what might come. B-roll, rancher moving carefully across the sunlit yard, rifle ready. Tessa joined him, her step deliberate, boots scuffing the dry earth, chest rising with determination. She no longer wore the weight of fear, it had been replaced with something sharper, fiercer, a readiness to meet the world on her own terms. They're close, she said, her voice low but steady. Elias nodded. Closer than I hoped. But not close enough to surprise us. Time slowed, each second drawn out by the heat and the wind and the wide, endless desert that had both nurtured and betrayed them. Then, from the far ridge, movement, the glint of metal, a shadow stepping clear, horses stirring in the dry grass. They're coming, Elias muttered. Tessa's hand brushed his sleeve. Not in fear, but in affirmation. We meet them together. The words were both declaration and oath. Elias allowed himself a small nod, feeling a shift in the world, something irrevocable. She was no longer the woman he protected, she was a partner, a presence woven into the same line of defense he had drawn in the dust hours before. The riders broke from cover, a half-dozen of them, deliberate and cautious. Elias raised his rifle, but he did not fire. Instead, he stepped forward and planted his boots firmly, letting the weight of calm authority radiate outward. Tessa moved beside him, hands empty, eyes sharp. She did not flinch. She did not waver. She met the rider's gaze as equals, her posture demanding recognition, not mercy. Turn back, Elias called, his voice carrying over the wind. This is not your fight. One of the riders sneered. Another laughed. But Tessa did not step behind him, and he did not step in front of her. Together, they were a line, a boundary the world could not ignore. And then something in the leader's eyes shifted, a recognition perhaps of determination that refused to be broken. The horses fidgeted, restless under the heat, the riders reconsidering the cost of pressing further. Tessa raised her chin slightly. We are ready, she said. But do not mistake caution for weakness. Elias exhaled, feeling the tension ebb just slightly. He knew then, with a clarity that did not require words, this was the moment of belonging. She had chosen to stand. And in standing, she had claimed a place beside him, not as a dependent, not as a ward, but as an equal, a companion bound by shared trust and shared resolve. The riders paused, the desert holding its breath. For now, the threat had not ended, but the bond between them had been forged in fire and shadow, unbreakable. And together, they faced it. The seasons turned slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the sun arced over the vast expanse of the ranch and retreated behind distant mesas. Summer baked the earth into ochre and rust, fall painted the cottonwoods along the creek in gold and amber, winter came soft and silent, dusting the fences with frost that glimmered like scattered diamonds. Inside the house, life had found its rhythm. The air smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs, the floorboards familiar beneath calloused feet. Elias moved with quiet precision, tending the land and livestock, but always with an eye for Tessa, who now walked alongside him, her presence steady and assured. She moved through the chores with a measured grace, her hands capable and confident. She mended fences, tended wounds, and prepared meals, each action carried out with intent rather than obligation. The four maids watched her with quiet approval, their initial wariness replaced by a wary admiration. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, the horizon melting into crimson and violet, and speak in the low, deliberate tones of people who had known suffering and survived it. No one needed to fill the space with words, the land itself spoke in wind, in the cry of a lone bird, in the shimmer of the desert heat. One afternoon, as the sun poured golden light over the cattle, Elias looked at Tessa. Her hair caught in the breeze, her eyes steady and warm. The line in the dust he had drawn months before was no longer just an abstract boundary, it had become a life, shared and defended, a sanctuary built by mutual choice and quiet courage. Tessa caught his gaze and smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of the lips, but enough to convey everything words could not. "We've made it," she whispered, though neither needed the confirmation. The desert continued its slow, patient rhythm around them, sometimes harsh, sometimes forgiving, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was part of their story now, a silent witness to a life rebuilt on trust, resilience, and the deliberate decision to belong. Elias exhaled, letting the weight of years and grief and choice settle behind him. For the first time in a long time, the world felt quiet, not empty, permanent, not precarious. And Tessa's hand brushed against his, a gentle claim of the future they had chosen together. In that quiet, sunlit moment, the legacy of what they had endured was clear: survival had not been enough. They had built something more: peace, shared strength, and the enduring truth that belonging was a choice made with courage, every single day.